This is House Planning Help, episode 173. Hello, I'm Ben Adam Smith, and this is the podcast for you if you're interested in self-build, because I'm exploring what houses we should be building in the 21st century and trying to break down the major roadblocks that may get in our way. Coming up in this session, my guest is sociologist Michaela Benson from Goldsmiths. We're looking at how our housing needs change through our lives. Is there such a thing as the forever home? We'll dig into that shortly. You might remember a little while back I was talking about how I prepare my son for our house build, and hopefully our daughter will arrive in the next weeks or months. So that's going to be exciting. So two of them to prepare for this big project and a bit of moving around into rented accommodation. And then I got an email from my podcast editor, Emma, and she was saying, well, you do know that I had to do this when I was 4. And I always like this. I try to assemble a team of people who really get what we're doing on this podcast, but I actually, hands up, didn't know this. I think I might have known that Emma's dad had a background in building and actually probably has quite a large company. But anyway, we'll read what Emma said. My parents had their house built when I was 4. We moved from a house that I'd lived in from being born and moved into a tiny rented house while we were waiting for the house to be built. I looked at it as a massive adventure, and my parents would take me down to site all the time. They made sure all the familiar things like my favourite toys, bed, routine were still the same at the rented house, and I seemed to take it all fine. I love the day we moved into the new house and remember it well. It all smelled brand new, and the thought that we were the very first people to be living there made me excited. I'm sure James will be just grand, just don't lose any of his favourite toys during the moving process. And that is a good point, because it can, if everything's boxed up, and maybe not lose it, but it can get stuck in a box somewhere that you don't find for some time. Good tips there. And if you've got a story, I'd love to read out some more of these. If there's useful information that you've got, then just get in touch via houseplanninghelp.com. And actually, just one more thing before we move on. Preparing for a house move, I'm reflecting on some of the things that we love with our house, and so I want to put a couple of videos together. I've got one of those live now, and this is all about the space in this house, because yes, it might be too small, but there's a great guiding principle. We use all the space every day. So I'll put that video into the show notes. Quick thank you for our topic and a bit of steering. I always, when I chat to people, love to hear thoughts, and Katrina Thacker is someone I met down at the National Self-Build and Renovation Centre when I was doing a talk there. And she was just saying, Ben, have you ever done anything on lifelong homes? How do our needs change? And I think this is a really good subject. I probably should have done something before now, but I haven't. So let's get to our featured interview. Sociologist Michaela Benson from Goldsmiths. She's making a return to the podcast. She helped us in episode 101 when we did 5 common traits of self-builders. And today I just jumped straight into it by asking Michaela about our basic needs as human beings to begin with. This is in relation to homes.
Oh my, that's a very large question to start off with, Ben. I think that when we're thinking about dwellings, I suppose would be really what you're interested in specifically. Quite often we're looking for things that meet quite a simple level of comfort. Here in the UK, we'd definitely be looking for something with bathrooms, with kitchens, with the space for the types of lives that we want to lead. That would be the kind of basic level that I think that people would want. Obviously, when we start to talk about self-built houses, things maybe start to get a little bit more precise, I suppose, in terms of being able to refine it. Because the thing about a self-built home, as opposed to a house that you buy, like the one that we're sitting in now, is that you have some control over the internal layout. You might have some control over the size, where it's to a certain degree, depending on what land's available, where it's located, all of those types of things. So there are various different things that we would need to take into account if we were going to talk about what people are looking for in a dwelling or in the buildings that they're going to live in.
There is a difference, though, isn't there, between needs and wants, even in things like comfort. You know, you could put up with something pretty unpleasant.
Yes, I think that you're absolutely right. And of course, we're talking about a culture in which quite often people have the possibility of having desires for particular ways of living, having the ability to kind of have houses that fit more to the needs of their families rather than necessarily, just saying, right, well, this is a house and this is where you live. So, and these are the things that are there. So, yeah, there's a lot of variation within that. And there are certain privileges that go with even being in a position to say, okay, I want something comfortable.
Let's talk about some of the stages in life and how that might change what we would want or need. I think we might find ourselves coming backwards and forwards to want and need. But yeah, maybe you could run through those character types as you might have defined them in some academic work that you've done.
Yeah, so I think that probably it's not very profound what I'm about to say, but, it's really clear that at different stages in our lives and in our relationships with other people, our family relationships or otherwise, there are quite different needs from housing. And this would vary from things relating to the proximity of where we live to where we work, for example, how a house needs to function in order to support family life if you have small children, versus if you have teenagers, for example, the requirements of that are going to be quite different. And how a house might function, for example, when you're a little bit older and you want to stay in your own house, how does a house need to function at that stage in order to support independent living? So I think that there are various different things there, from the location to the structure of the house and how it comes to support the lives of the people that live within it, which I think are things that probably members of the general public are all too well aware of in many ways, but which I guess today we're just laying out a little bit more in terms of opening up that discussion a bit.
But you don't think about it so much. Yes, it might happen. I would say in terms of growing up, I know you could start as kids, but the first time you really think about it is when you leave home, isn't it? Because it's your responsibility at that point.
Yes, I think at that point where you exit the environment within which your parents have been or your guardians have been in control of your housing, and you have to start making those decisions for yourself, definitely that's the moment at which you're thrown in at the deep end, actually. I think at that point, I don't think that very many people in that situation are aware of the extent of the decisions that are being made on a day-to-day basis about their housing and supporting their housing through, thinking about, down to how much the electricity is, So I think you're right. That is the first point at which you start to consider that. But that's part of a kind of a lifelong thought process that develops as your needs and desires change, as your life changes, as your relationships change over the course of your life. And when I say relationships, I'm not just talking about, the relationships that you might have with your partner. There might be all sorts of other relationships that are involved within that. I know that we're also seeing, for example, the rise of people sharing houses who are not, married or living together, not in romantic relationships, but because of perhaps their particular needs in relation to affordability, all of those kinds of things, but also perhaps in kind of reconsidering the ways that we live together, which is quite a significant shift. So
I guess it would make sense to come into that a little bit later and just look at the 2.4 children. Before we go any further, should we look back? What does it do to you, the house that you've lived in as a child? I mean, does that really shape you in a big way, or you think you can stride out when you first come to that important point of, well, where am I going to live?
So you see, I come at that from quite a different angle. I mean, I spent from the age of, from the time I was born until the age of 11, I moved house every 18 months. So I'm not so sure about whether it's to do in my imagination, which might be very different to other people's, whether that's the thing that shaped me, or whether it was the kind of the housing, the decisions that my parents were taking about that, and how they then kept our family together, irrespective of where we lived.
Dare I ask, why did this happen every 18 months?
My dad's job, yeah. Right. My dad's job. So we moved around with my father's job, which I think changed my relationship to housing and homes in various ways, although that's not a foregone conclusion either. Just because you move around doesn't mean that you like to move around.
But you're sitting next to someone who only knows one family home that still exists, and that I'm actually, after I finish this interview, going back to. But there will become a time when, probably in the near future, when that is not the family home, and I've no idea what that will do to me.
So maybe I can turn the question around and ask you what you think that does for you.
Well, it was always a safe place to go back to. I was lucky that my parents would always let us come back. They weren't the ones who would just throw you out and say, right, well, that's it, you're never coming back here. It was always, you can come back when you need to, and perhaps we did, and maybe we overstayed our welcome for a couple of years, but then we'd go back out and find our own way. So it was, and still is, that solid base, and has some really strong, happy feelings associated with it, which is why I think when it does come to that time of, we did think about for a while, would we want to take on that house? But just for the needs and the things that I want to do, I think that would be a huge mistake taking it on, because it would have to be altered in a massive way, and that would upset my memories, really.
I suppose, though, there might be other ways in which that experience of knowing that one house for the whole of your life impacts what you now consider doing in relation to your own children. And is this something that you then are looking for?
Maybe it is.
That's because you associate the stability and security with that house, with a way of creating stability and security for children, perhaps.
Yes, I'm not saying it's right, because I think you can have a perfectly stable, happy childhood moving around. But I think it was nice to have that base that you know where it is in the world. And I've met people when I've been travelling who have said, I don't live anywhere, I live where I am now, which I understand too.
Yeah, I think what's coming out through that discussion is the various different ways that people make a feeling of being at home. I think that's what we're getting to through that. And as you rightly point out, there is no one way of doing that. There might be various other ways in which that's managed within families, within households. And not to mention the fact that obviously there are some people for whom home doesn't have those positive associations that you and I might talk about. I just thought I would just mention that. We wouldn't want people to think that we're being too romantic about the idea of home. But certainly, I suppose the other thing that you're concerned about there, of course, is your parents' needs as they grow older, and what that house then becomes for them. No longer perhaps the happy family home where they raised you and your siblings.
I'll also chip this in, that it's a house that grew with our family. So it started as a cottage, and then it was extended, and then another possibly 15, 20 years later it was extended again. So it's a large house as well, which is really for two people most of the time, but still that great base to come back to.
Yes, and I suppose, I think that this is quite a common story. I don't think that this is an uncommon story, that certain types of houses have that capacity. They have the space in which to grow with a family. And quite often people might move into them with the intention of their house growing, which I think is a lovely analogy for thinking about a family as well. So I think that there are those possibilities. Some properties are just not really well disposed to doing that. I think increasingly with the smaller amounts of land that things are on, then actually we might see people more likely to kind of scale up through their housing ladder in order to get those bigger properties.
By moving, you're talking about? By
moving, yeah. The kind of relocation in order to get the bigger property to house the growing family, which seems to be, again, quite a common way that people think about it. And they often, I think, think about it in relation to particular points in their children's lives as well, often around things to do with schooling, which is another way that people choose their housing, not just to be close to work, but to be close to school. So we do see quite significant relocations relating to those points in children's lives, not necessarily the points in their adults' lives as well, which I think is very interesting too.
My own self-build, I'm finally making a bit of progress, but it's quite interesting because I have to think that this is a stage where my family is growing, and I'm expecting a daughter to arrive in a couple of months, maybe sooner, never know. And so we're creating this house. We have the choice of what we do with this plan. And so how do you work out what are my needs going to be in the short, medium and long term? It's difficult.
I think that's a really good question. And I think that in the research that I did with people who were self-building, there were various ways in which they were thinking about the future or not. Not everyone thinks beyond now. It depends what the project is imagined to become in some respects. So you'd get everything from people who were very, very detailed, like almost scenario building, what happens if, and would this house be able to accommodate us if such and such happened? Quite often people who were retired, who'd been through various different housing transitions already and got to a stage where, they were still very healthy and fit, thinking, okay, well, how do we make it so this house, which suits our needs for now, can be perhaps transformed into something that will work for us if our needs change. So sometimes there is that, from the man who put a lift into his house. So, you know how much space a lift takes up. But, so he had a lift in his house that would take him from the top floor to the ground floor in case he would need that going forwards.
There's another element, and you giving that example there has just made me remember watching one of these TV self-build shows, and they showed how this woman had transformed her, I don't know, it must have been a period dwelling. At the front door they had some steps, and because she couldn't get down these steps anymore, she had
a ramp.
Well, not even a ramp. I don't know why that wasn't an option. I think it might have been some weird planning thing. So she had this lift put in that cost £100,000, just these steps that would move up. And that was not a small amount of money for her, but she must have had such a big attachment to this house that she didn't want to move on.
Yes, I think that's clearly the case, and you could see how that might happen, particularly in the case of a self-build, where people have spent huge amounts of time and energy and invested a lot of emotional labour into the construction of these homes. The trade-off, I think, is the thing that you're saying, which is, £100,000 lift, or that
you could put towards your retirement. She was probably at the right time to downsize.
Yeah, but she didn't want to downsize. Not everybody wants to, and I think that this is something that should be aware of, that people get used to living in particular sizes of property. We might say, oh, that's too big for those two people, but they're used to that, and that's what they want, and they become very attached to their homes, whether it's a self-build or not, as your example very clearly demonstrates. But I think that there are other people who are using the transition into retirement as a way of thinking, okay, what do we want our future to look like? What do we want our retirement to look like? Retirement's a useful transition to think with, which is why I keep returning to it. What do we want our retirement to look like? What do we want our house to look like in order to facilitate that? And so you get these, as it turns out, there were quite a high percentage of people that I worked with who had built at retirement, thinking about, okay, so I'm not going to be going out to work anymore. So what are the things that I want to be doing on a day-to-day basis? So whether that is, the woodworking workshop of one man who was really, an amazing carpenter, it turned out, not something that he'd done during his working life except in his spare time, but had decided to take that up. That was one example. So they made sure that they had that on the front of their house. Trying to think of some other examples.
I'll chip in one more you're thinking, because my mother-in-law is a hobbyist, and she's great with knitting and materials and making things. But interestingly, the hobbies have just overtaken rooms to such a degree now that we're not sure that we can go back and stay with them at the moment, because it's too much effort to empty out all the rooms and But yeah, that's quite an interesting one.
This was, again, I had an example like that where at one stage they lived in a caravan on site while it was being built. But the first thing that they built was the garage, and their son and his wife, this is going to sound terrible, they lived in the garage for a little while. And that's now become her hobby room. And it's huge. It's absolutely packed with all of those boxes because all of that equipment takes up a lot of space. But what I really liked about that example is very often you hear about, the man's shed. I mean, this is a very, very common thing. And in this case, this very wonderful, it's a multi-generational self-build, actually, a family that all live together, 3 generations. This wonderful family who'd, said, okay, well, it's actually the mum that's got all of these activities that she wants to pursue. And it was almost like a labour of love to create this space for her to have all of her hobbies there, which I thought was really, really touching in a way to create that space for her. So,
while you've brought it up, multi-generational living, how does it come about? Is it a very active decision, or does it become more of we need to look after elderly relative and so they move in?
So I only had one case of that within the wider project, and in that case it was very much an active decision. And it was an active decision based on a whole range of factors, which included the fact that the middle generation, it's very difficult when you start talking about parents and children, the middle generation, so the son, he had a job quite far away. He couldn't afford to buy a property in London, essentially. And they said, well, come and live with us. We'll build this big house on this plot. I mean, it was a huge plot. The house basically was going to cost more to renovate than to tear down. So, again, they'd lived there for 30 years. So they'd lived there for a really long time. And the house was tired and old. And the cost of all of the work that needed to be done to make it livable just seemed crazy. So the cost benefit. So they said, well, why don't you come and live with us? Huge plot. So they built this big house where the son and his wife and their 2 very small children live on one side of the house, and the grandparents live on the ground floor on the other side of the house, which is another way of managing those things. And I think that there is an idea that, maybe in the future they might need some care, but at the moment they're providing the childcare support as well for these 2 young children. So in that respect, there is a sense of, okay, going forwards, this will be one solution. But it's also, what the needs are for now. There are childcare needs, there were housing affordability needs, all of those things all wrapped up together, so it's quite difficult to disentangle them.
Are there other types of living that we should draw into this, such as co-housing?
I think so. I understand now that there's a lot of conversation about co-housing, particularly for the over 50s. There's a very kind of a big push towards these kind of co-housing communities for precisely those types of reasons, to do with, fears about becoming isolated during old age, fears about requiring kind of neighbourly support in lieu of the possibility of, families being there to provide that type of day-to-day interaction. So I think that that's definitely on the increase. But we're also seeing, particularly in London, an increase in young people living together, not necessarily co-housing with all the rules that go around that, and living together for far longer than we might have assumed through the kind of student living type of model. And there are people in their 20s and 30s who are choosing to put together kind of co-housing groups as well. So those are very different ways of thinking about how to live than, the nuclear family.
Is that still the aspiration, or again, is that far from it, that it can be fun, a load of you living together, but does there become that stage in life where actually it is going, not the nuclear family, because we know that never works out perfectly, but going down that route of I need my own space, I need my own garden, so forth?
Yeah, I think that there have always been people who thought about living differently, living differently to the norm, whatever that norm might be. And I think that that's just being made visible in a way that we haven't necessarily seen before. There's nothing particularly natural about living in a family unit, for example. It's something that's culturally accepted. So from that point of view, I think it's really interesting that we're starting to see these other ways of living being made visible again. And we know that there have been various moments in recent British history, if we're just going to focus on the UK, where various alternative forms of living, cooperative living, which is the one that people seem to remember most often, currently co-housing, are being seen as feasible alternative ways of living. And we're trying to find the financial and legal structures, let alone the kind of built environment structures, which can support those alternative ways of living. So I think that there are various aspirations. There have always been lots of different aspirations. And again, as people go through their lives, what they want and what they desire, as we've said before, does change. So just because you might move into a co-housing community now doesn't mean that in 20 years that's going to fulfill the requirements of what you want from your day-to-day living in the same way as it does now. Just as I live in a house with my husband. I'm not, obviously this will be a surprise to him that this is just completely a fictional scenario, and it might be that in 5 years we might want to do that differently. There are prospects for doing that. You don't have to get locked into to one way of being. But certainly I think that there is still a prevailing aspiration for individual home ownership. I think that's what the prevailing aspiration is and has been for a long time.
Are there any averages of how many different places we might live in?
Not that I'm aware of. It's not something I've looked into I'm sure we will all at least 5 or 6 right up to, it could be loads of different places. You see, you're saying that now, and I know that in the last 5 years I've lived in 4 different properties. So
well, I was trying to say,
what
have you been doing?
I'm just moving around for work.
You just like, but I was just saying at that lower end that even if you wanted to live in that forever home, I think if you tracked back what you'd actually done, you would have lived in quite a few places.
I think that you're right, and I also think that one of the big headlines about self-build is that people stay in their houses for longer. Okay, now I'm going to say something a little bit controversial here, but we also know that because the British economy is founded so much on housing, we need people to move house. And we know that that's the case. That's one of the things that keeps the market rolling over. So that's always something to bear in mind. And I do think that there are, needs change, requirements change, jobs change, schools change, families change. And those are the things that quite often prompt those changes. And I think that quite a lot of people will, looking back, there'll be points in their lives where they move a lot more than others. So yes, that's, there are, very real reasons why people move.
You mentioned that self-builders stay in their homes for longer. So what is it that's doing that? Is it this commitment to, I've gone through this slog, I am not moving out of this house? Or why? Why do they not just find themselves moving on after a few years? Because we know things change.
So I think it would be fair to say that compared with people who find themselves in a position where they're buying a house on the open market, self-builders have to make far fewer compromises over what they get from their houses. Because that's one of the driving forces behind building your own property, very often, not always, is about having that control over how your house functions or what it does for you. And so provided, these are lots of provisos, provided that the house actually delivers that you don't get to the end of your self-build in, a bad situation, which is a rare occurrence anyway. And provided your needs don't radically change in the first few years that you're living there, then you could see why they might stay for longer. Now, there are exceptions to that. The exceptions to that are the people who are building a house now so that they can spiral up. This also happens. Kind of individual property developers type, who do want to live in the house for a while, but see it just as a stepping stone to the next self-build, the self-build that they really want. And there are various narratives which would tell you about how much you can expect to make. So those become much more rational and strategic moves than the people who are building their forever home. But I did notice, for example, in one case, I worked with a family who had built a passive house, and the woman in the relationship was explaining how this was her forever home, and the man was saying, "Well, perhaps in a few years we'll build something else." And there were very specific reasons why he wanted to do that. Unfortunately, he'd been ill during the build, and I suspect that he felt a little bit distanced from it as a consequence of that. Whereas for her, it was this dream house. But you also know yourself, when you move into a new house, you're like, wow, what a lovely sometimes you are, what a lovely new house. And you get used to it over time. And perhaps sometimes people just want a change as well. So, obviously the people who are in a position to do that, are very, very privileged. But that's something to take into account, is that there are these desires and wants and needs that change.
I'd just like to bring it back to my own self-build. You can analyse this. And so I've got this house that's bigger than perhaps I ever envisaged building, but that's just the land really that's dictating a lot of that. We're still building a much smaller house than you could build on this site. And we've made some allowances for guest room downstairs that would then mean older generation can have bathroom, bedroom on that lower level. So that's some thinking ahead that we've done. And we've also thought that we will be using most of this space, the vast majority, every day. So my office will double as a bedroom. But this philosophy, you don't know, will I get 5 years down the line and think, why didn't I just build more space than I needed and had that spare room there? I don't think that will happen, because this is quite a lot bigger, and I just can't foresee what we would need unless we have another 2 children or something.
Well, yes, I mean, that's always at risk. But I suppose at the same time, if you're building something that you think suits the life that you envisage having for the next 3 to 5 years, which I guess is where it is, then you're probably doing okay there. I mean, I think that it's, I know how long you've been embarking on this quest to build your own house. So I suspect that you've put a lot of thought and effort into thinking about what you actually need. And I don't
think I need that much. When I actually look at what we've got already, this is the weird thing, I'm going to build my own house, but it's really what I'm after is just the passive house comfort and the energy savings. But I have everything I want, more or less, in my current house, except for the fact that it's a squeeze.
So what you've done there, and this is something that, again, I found quite frequently when I was talking with the people in the research who had built their own houses, was they've actually thought about how they use the spaces that they've lived in previously. That might be the current space that they're living in while they're preparing for building, or it might be more historic houses as well that they've lived in. And they think a lot of them think very, very carefully about those issues of what they want their space to do.
Going through the designs as well. That's a really interesting process. I enjoyed that. Really
interesting, yeah. So I think it's very, very common to think to a point of reference, which is, okay, what's the house I live in now like? What's the house that I enjoyed living in the past like? Why did I like that? What was it that the space offered in these particular ways? Is it sheer? Is it actually the floor size? Or is there something else going on there? Is it the light? There could be all sorts of reasons why particular places suit particular people's lives. And I mean, again, having moved house several times in the last few years, it's something I've become acutely aware of, what types of spaces suit me and my partner. So from that point of view, I think that's quite a common way of approaching it, which I think more often than not produces the right outcome. So,
is there anything else that might tie up this conversation? Because I know we've just had a bit of a natter here. It's been useful, but anything that might give some clarity? Someone coming into a self-build, they know that they've got their land and they're starting to develop those designs.
A lot of this is about the future, right? So it's about thinking about how long you want to be somewhere. Some people might not want to be in a house for longer than 5 years. How long do you want to be there? And will that house still offer what you need or what your family wants or needs, within that space of time? And I think that's as far as you could go. So ask yourself a very honest question about how long you envisage being there. If you envisage being there forever, think about what possible things could change in your life, which would mean that your house would need to function in a different way to support you living there. To a certain degree, building regulation allows for some of that. All of the plugs being at however many centimetres they are off the ground. That's all to do with that, and making sure that there's toilet facilities on the ground floor. All of that is precisely to do with that. But that's very, very basic in terms of requirements for what people might need should they find themselves living at home, getting old, with particular types of needs that might come with that. So always asking the question, how long do I want to be here? What might change in my circumstances? Within reason. You don't have to be too fatalistic about that, but what might change? And how can I make sure that this house that I am investing in, because I want to live in it forever, if that's the case, or I want to live in it for 10 years, continues to fulfill those needs or desires? Now, of course, there are always going to be things that we don't anticipate, but I think having very honest conversations with ourselves about what might happen can help a little bit with that.
Michaela, thank you very much.
Thank you, Ben.
Head online to take a look at the show notes that accompany this session, houseplanninghelp.com/173. You can review all the main information. Perhaps you've got a comment or you'd like to ask a question. Scroll down to the bottom of the show notes as per usual. We'll link you across to Michaela on Twitter. Also put in the Goldsmiths website, houseplanninghelp.com/173. Let's finish up with an iTunes review. This one's titled First Rate Podcast, and it's from S. Batchel, I think that is. Came across the website and podcast as I'm just about to embark on a retrofit and extension of a house to Passive House principles. My architect is a previous contributor, and one of his clients also shared his experiences. I've learnt something from every episode, even if it didn't look immediately relevant, and Ben's skills as an interviewer and professional presentation make every episode an easy listen. Well, thank you for that. Much appreciated. And if you haven't done this already, we really do encourage it. I don't really understand the iTunes algorithm, but when we get a few reviews coming our way, it really does seem to lift us up and give us a boost. So if you're finding the information in this podcast or other podcasts helping you on your journey, just do us a quick favour. Get onto iTunes or however you're listening to us and write a review, and that will be much appreciated at this end. Okay, that's as far as we go for today. The House Planning Help podcast is produced by Regen Media, content that matters.